It's November 8th, 1519. Spanish conquistador Hernán Cortés stands at the edge of a massive causeway, staring across the shimmering waters of Lake Texcoco. What he sees defies everything he knows about the world. Rising from the lake like a fever dream is a city more magnificent than anything in Europe. Gleaming white pyramids, floating gardens, aqueducts carrying fresh water across impossible distances. Tenochtitlan, the heart of the Aztec Empire. A metropolis of 200,000 people, larger than London, Paris or Rome. One of Cortés's soldiers would later write, "We were amazed. Some of our soldiers asked whether the things that we saw were not a dream. But this wasn't a dream. This was real. And within 2 years, it would all be gone, reduced to rubble, its people decimated, its secrets buried beneath the stones of what we now call Mexico City." The Aztec story doesn't begin with empire. It begins with wandering, with prophecy, and with a vision so powerful it would drive an entire people across hundreds of miles of hostile territory. The year is approximately 1100 CE. A semi-nomadic tribe called the Mexica, the people we would later call Aztecs, are leaving their mythical homeland of Aztlan. Nobody knows exactly where Aztlan was. Some scholars think it was in northern Mexico. Others believe it might have been in the southwestern United States. The Aztecs themselves described it as an island in a lake, a paradise they were commanded to leave by their god Huitzilopochtli, the hummingbird of the south, god of war and the sun. But here's what makes this journey extraordinary. Huitzilopochtli gave them specific instructions. He told them to wander until they found a very particular sign, an eagle perched on a cactus devouring a serpent. Only there could they build their city. Only there would they fulfill their destiny as the chosen people of the sun. For nearly 200 years, the Mexica wandered. They weren't welcomed anywhere. The established city-states of central Mexico saw them as barbaric outsiders, uncivilized nomads who practiced human sacrifice with disturbing enthusiasm. They were driven from place to place, sometimes enslaved, always despised. In one notorious incident around 1323, the Mexica had been allowed to settle near the city-state of Culhuacan. To cement the alliance, the Mexica asked the Culhua king for his daughter, ostensibly to become the bride of their chief. The king agreed. What happened next is almost too shocking to believe. The Mexica didn't marry the princess, they sacrificed her and flayed her skin. Then, during a ceremony to which they had invited the king, a priest wore his daughter's skin as a costume and danced before him in the firelight. The king, understandably horrified, drove the Mexica out with extreme violence. They fled into the marshes and swamps of Lake Texcoco, the least desirable, most mosquito-infested wasteland in the valley. Nobody wanted this land. It was where you sent your enemies to die slowly of disease and starvation. But the Mexica weren't just anyone. In 1325, somewhere in those miserable swamps, a group of Mexica priests saw it. On a small, muddy island, there it was. An eagle perched on a nopal cactus, holding a serpent in its talons. The prophecy had been fulfilled. They called their new city Tenochtitlan, place of the prickly pear cactus. And on that swampy, unwanted island, they would build something that would make the rest of the world tremble. Within 200 years, these despised outcasts would rule an empire stretching from the Atlantic to the Pacific, commanding tribute from over 400 cities, controlling a territory of roughly 80,000 square miles, and presiding over a population of 5 to 6 million people. How did the most hated people in Mexico become its absolute masters? The answer lies in a combination of military genius, agricultural innovation, political cunning, and a religious worldview so intense it would fuel an empire, and ultimately contribute to its catastrophic fall. Let's talk about that swamp for a moment, because what the Aztecs did with it represents one of the most impressive engineering achievements in human history. The land was useless, flooded, salty, impossible to farm. But the Aztecs looked at this nightmare and saw opportunity. They invented a farming technique called chinampa, what the Spanish would later call floating gardens. Here's how it worked. They drove wooden stakes into the shallow lake bed and wove them together with reeds and branches, creating rectangular frames. Then they piled layers upon layers of mud, lake vegetation, and waste into these frames until they rose above the water level. They planted willow trees at the corners. Their roots would grow down and anchor the entire structure to the lake bed. The result? Incredibly fertile artificial islands that could produce up to 7 harvests per year. The constant moisture from the surrounding canals meant they never had to worry about rainfall. These chinampas were so productive that they could feed not just Tenochtitlan, but the entire Valley of Mexico. You can still see remnants of this system today in Xochimilco, south of Mexico City. Tourists take colorful boats through the canals, completely unaware they're floating through the remnants of one of history's most sophisticated agricultural systems. But the Aztecs didn't stop with farming. They built massive causeways connecting their island city to the mainland, some over 3 miles long, wide enough for 10 horses to ride abreast. They constructed an aqueduct system that brought fresh spring water from the mountains directly into the city. They created a sophisticated grid of canals that served as streets, allowing canoe traffic to move goods and people throughout the metropolis. The main pyramid, the Templo Mayor, rose 90 feet into the air, dominating the skyline. Around it sprawled a city of white limestone buildings, painted murals, gardens and marketplaces. The central market at Tlatelolco was so large that Spanish observers estimated 60,000 people visited it daily. You could buy anything there: gold jewelry, jade carvings, exotic feathers from tropical birds, jaguar pelts, cacao beans, which served as currency, obsidian blades sharper than modern surgical steel, vanilla, chili peppers, tomatoes, avocados, and even live animals from distant regions. The Spanish were genuinely stunned. One conquistador, Bernal Diaz del Castillo, wrote, "When we saw all those cities and villages built in the water and other great towns on dry land and that straight and level causeway leading to Mexico, we were astounded. These great towns and buildings rising from the water, all made of stone, seemed like an enchanted vision. Indeed, some of our soldiers asked whether it was not all a dream. But underneath all this beauty, all this sophistication, all this engineering brilliance, there was something else, something darker. To understand the Aztecs, you must understand their cosmology, their view of how the universe worked. And it was terrifying. The Aztecs believed they were living in the 5th sun, the 5th creation of the world. The previous 4 worlds had been destroyed by catastrophic disasters. Jaguars devouring humanity, hurricanes, fiery rain, and floods. This current world, they believed, would also end, specifically by earthquakes and starvation. But there was a way to delay this apocalypse. The sun, Tonatiuh, was engaged in a cosmic battle every single day. Each night he descended into the underworld to fight the forces of darkness. Each morning he needed strength to rise again. Without that strength, the sun would fail, the world would end, darkness would consume everything. How do you feed a god? How do you keep the sun moving across the sky? With blood, human blood. The Aztecs didn't invent human sacrifice. It was practiced throughout Mesoamerica, but they industrialized it. They turned it into state policy on a scale never seen before. Here's where the story gets truly chilling. The Aztecs believed the most potent offering to the gods was the heart of a living human being, still beating, freshly torn from the chest. The victim would be stretched across a sacrificial stone. 4 priests would hold down the arms and legs. A 5th priest, using an obsidian blade, would make a deep incision beneath the ribcage, reach in and physically tear out the heart while it was still pumping. The body would then be thrown down the pyramid steps. In some rituals, the corpses were dismembered and eaten, not out of cruelty, but as a sacred act. To consume the flesh of someone sacrificed to the gods was to share in their divine essence. How many people died this way? The numbers are hotly debated. Spanish sources claim tens of thousands were sacrificed annually. Some accounts describe 80,000 victims sacrificed over 4 days during the rededication of the Templo Mayor in 1487, though modern historians consider this number greatly exaggerated, possibly propaganda to justify Spanish conquest. More conservative modern estimates suggest somewhere between 1,000 to 20,000 sacrifices per year across the empire. Even at the lower end, we're talking about an industrial-scale religious killing operation. But here's what Western audiences often miss. From the Aztec perspective, this wasn't murder. This was cosmic necessity. The priests weren't serial killers. They were performing the most sacred duty imaginable. They were quite literally saving the world. Moreover, many sacrifice victims weren't unwilling. Being chosen for sacrifice to Huitzilopochtli or Tezcatlipoca was considered a tremendous honor. Warriors captured in battle knew that dying on the sacrificial stone guaranteed them paradise, a place in the highest heaven accompanying the sun on its daily journey across the sky. The Aztecs had a saying, "There is nothing like death in war, nothing like flowery death, so precious to him who gives life. Far off I see it, my heart yearns for it." This religious intensity permeated every aspect of Aztec society. Children were educated in warrior skills and religious devotion from an early age. Everyone had a role in maintaining the cosmic order. And at the center of it all stood the emperor. Not just a political leader, but a semi-divine figure whose power came directly from the gods. By the time Hernán Cortés arrived in 1519, the Aztec Empire was at its absolute peak. Wealthy, powerful, seemingly invincible. At its head was Montezuma II, the 9th emperor, a man whose name would become synonymous with the tragic collision between two worlds. Montezuma wasn't born to rule. He was a younger son, a high priest and military commander who seized power in 1502 through a combination of religious authority and political maneuvering. Under his rule, the empire expanded further than ever before, extracting tribute from hundreds of subjugated cities. But Montezuma had a problem, multiple problems actually. First, the empire was overstretched. Maintaining control over such vast territories required constant military campaigns. Subject peoples resented Aztec rule, particularly the demands for tribute and sacrificial victims. The Tlaxcalans, a confederation east of Tenochtitlan, had successfully resisted Aztec domination for decades and nursed bitter hatred toward their would-be conquerors. Second, strange omens had begun appearing. According to later Aztec accounts, admittedly recorded after the conquest and possibly influenced by Spanish interpreters, comets streaked across the sky. A temple spontaneously burst into flames and couldn't be extinguished. A woman's voice was heard wailing through the night. "My children, we are lost!" The waters of Lake Texcoco churned violently without wind. People saw visions of strange towers floating on the sea. Whether these omens actually occurred or were retrospective attempts to make sense of catastrophe, we can't know for certain. But we do know that in April 1519, Montezuma received disturbing news. Strange men with pale skin and beards had arrived on the eastern coast. They rode on animals like giant deer. They wielded weapons that produced thunder and lightning. They had floating temples that moved across the water with white wings. The Spanish had arrived. Montezuma faced an impossible choice. Ancient prophecies spoke of the return of Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent god who had once ruled as a benevolent king before sailing away to the east, promising to return in the year one reed. In the Aztec calendar, 1519 was one reed. Montezuma did something that would prove fatal. He hesitated. He sent gifts, gold, precious stones, elaborate featherwork. He hoped to either appease these beings or learn more about their intentions. But those golden gifts had exactly the opposite effect. The Spanish saw the wealth and wanted more, much more. Let's be clear about who Hernán Cortés was. He wasn't a noble knight on a holy mission. He was a 34-year-old adventurer from minor Spanish nobility who had spent years in the Caribbean colonies accomplishing very little. He was in debt, restless, hungry for glory and gold. When the opportunity came to lead an expedition to the Mexican mainland, he grabbed it, even defying the governor of Cuba, who had ordered the mission cancelled. Cortés sailed with about 600 men, 16 horses, several cannons, and a handful of war dogs. By any rational calculation, this tiny force had no business conquering an empire of millions. But Cortés had advantages Montezuma didn't fully grasp. First, the Spanish possessed military technology that seemed like magic to the Aztecs. Steel swords, armor, crossbows, arquebuses, early guns, and most importantly, horses, animals that didn't exist in the Americas. The psychological impact of mounted cavalry charges on people who had never seen horses cannot be overstated. Second, the Spanish brought invisible allies, diseases, smallpox, measles, typhus, epidemics that would eventually kill somewhere between 80% to 95% of the indigenous population. The first smallpox outbreak wouldn't arrive until 1520, but when it did, it devastated Tenochtitlan in ways that Spanish steel never could. Third, and most crucially, Cortés understood the empire's fundamental weakness. Everyone hated the Aztecs. As the Spanish marched inland, they encountered the Totonacs, who were paying crushing tribute to Tenochtitlan. Cortés convinced them to stop sending tribute and join him instead. Next, he reached the Tlaxcalans. After several fierce battles, the Tlaxcalans realized the Spanish could be useful allies against their ancient enemies. They joined Cortés, providing thousands of warriors, supplies, and crucial intelligence about Aztec military tactics. By the time Cortés reached Tenochtitlan in November 1519, he commanded not just 600 Spaniards, but thousands of indigenous warriors eager to see the Aztec Empire fall. Montezuma, still paralyzed by uncertainty, made another catastrophic decision. He invited Cortés into the city as an honored guest. It was a trap that snapped shut on the wrong victim. Within days, Cortés had taken Montezuma hostage in his own palace, a prisoner in all but name, forced to rule as a Spanish puppet. For months, this bizarre situation persisted. Montezuma, held under guard by Spaniards, still commanded the empire. His people watched in confusion and growing anger. Then, in June 1520, everything exploded. What happened next is one of the most dramatic sequences in all of colonial history. While Cortés was briefly away from the city dealing with a Spanish force sent to arrest him, his second-in-command, Pedro de Alvarado, massacred hundreds of unarmed Aztec nobles during a religious festival. The reason? Alvarado claimed he had learned of a plot. More likely, he panicked or simply wanted to steal the gold the celebrants wore. The city erupted. The Aztecs, who had been growing increasingly hostile to the Spanish presence, finally struck back. They attacked the palace where the Spanish were housed, trapping them inside. Cortés raced back to find himself besieged in the heart of Tenochtitlan. The causeways, those magnificent engineering marvels, had become death traps. The Aztecs had torn up sections, leaving gaps that the Spanish couldn't cross. Tens of thousands of Aztec warriors surrounded the palace, and food and water were running out. In a desperate move, Cortés forced Montezuma to appear on the palace roof and beg his people to stop fighting. The response was heartbreaking. The emperor, who had once commanded absolute obedience, was met with stones and arrows. One struck him in the head. Within days, Montezuma was dead, killed either by his own people's projectiles or, as some sources suggest, murdered by the Spanish, who no longer had use for him. With Montezuma gone and the situation desperate, Cortés made the decision to escape. On the night of June 30th, 1520, a night that would be called La Noche Triste, the Night of Sorrows, the Spanish attempted to flee the city under cover of darkness and rain. It was a slaughter. Aztec warriors in canoes attacked from the waters. Gaps in the causeway became mass graves as heavily armored Spanish soldiers and their indigenous allies fell into the lake and drowned, weighed down by the gold they'd tried to carry. The Spanish lost perhaps 600 of their own men and several thousand Tlaxcalan allies. Those who survived that night told horrific stories. They described water choked with bodies, survivors clinging to floating corpses, the air filled with war cries and screams, the darkness lit by torches as the Aztecs pursued them relentlessly. Cortés himself supposedly wept beneath a tree after reaching the mainland, though whether from grief for his dead men or frustration at losing the city and its gold, we can only speculate. The Aztecs had won. The invaders had been driven out. Tenochtitlan was free again, but the victory would be short-lived, because Cortés carried something more dangerous than any weapon, a burning determination to return, and the knowledge that he now commanded thousands of indigenous allies who wanted the Aztecs destroyed. For nearly a year, Cortés regrouped. He built brigantines, shallow draft warships that could sail across Lake Texcoco, neutralizing the Aztecs' water-based advantages. He recruited more indigenous allies until his army numbered in the tens of thousands. And crucially, smallpox arrived. The epidemic hit Tenochtitlan like an atomic bomb. The new emperor, Cuitlahuac, died of the disease within months of taking power. His successor, Cuauhtémoc, whose name means descending eagle, inherited a city ravaged by plague, facing enemies on all sides. In May 1521, Cortés began his siege. This wasn't a quick assault. It was a methodical strangulation that would last 93 days. The Spanish brigantines controlled the lake, cutting off food and fresh water. Cortés systematically destroyed the aqueducts. His indigenous allies, now numbering perhaps 100,000 warriors, surrounded the city. Slowly, systematically, they advanced street by street, filling in canals, demolishing buildings to prevent ambushes, pushing the defenders back into an ever-shrinking perimeter. Inside Tenochtitlan, conditions became apocalyptic. The drinking water was contaminated, food ran out, people ate tree bark, leather, anything. The dead accumulated in the streets, victims of violence, disease, and starvation. The smell became unbearable. The Aztec defenders fought with stunning bravery. Cuauhtémoc, just 25 years old, led desperate counterattacks. Aztec warriors used guerrilla tactics, emerging from canals to attack and disappear. They captured Spanish soldiers alive, dragging them to the top of the pyramids where they were sacrificed in full view of their comrades. A psychological warfare tactic designed to break Spanish morale. But nothing could overcome the combination of disease, overwhelming numbers, starvation, and the systematic destruction of the city itself. On August 13, 1521, Cuauhtémoc attempted to flee by canoe. He was captured. The young emperor was brought before Cortés and spoke words that have echoed through Mexican history. I have done everything in my power to defend my kingdom and free it from your hands. Since fortune has not been favorable, take my life, for that would be just, and it is the best thing you can do. Take that dagger you have at your belt and kill me with it. Cortés didn't kill him immediately. He kept Cuauhtémoc alive for several years, eventually hanging him in 1525 during an expedition to Honduras on suspicion of plotting rebellion. The siege had cost perhaps 100,000 lives, mostly Aztec civilians and defenders. The city itself was utterly destroyed. A Spanish soldier wrote, "I swear that all the houses on the lake were full of heads and corpses. I do not know how to describe it, but it was the same in the streets and courts. We could not walk without treading on the bodies and heads of dead Indians." The greatest city in the Americas, larger than any European capital of its day, was gone. In its place, the Spanish would build Mexico City, using the stones of demolished pyramids as construction material. If you made it this far, you're clearly a history lover like me. Subscribe and hit the bell so you don't miss our next documentary. What lost civilization should we explore next? Let me know in the comments. Thanks for watching.